Welcome, everyone. My name is Nicholas de Villiers. I am professor of English and film at UNF, and we are very pleased and honored to have Cecilia Aldarondo here to speak to us about her film Landfall. Hopefully everyone was
Oh, sorry, Nick, I'm interrupting because Laura says, hang on.
Yes, just wait for everyone to enter. I got a signal that said to start.
Stop.
Welcome, everyone. We're just going to wait for everybody to enter the webinar. One thing we might do while people are joining is actually show the trailer. It's not a bad idea. So welcome, everyone. My name is Nicholas de Villiers, and what we thought we would do is to just show the trailer for Landfall before our discussion and Q&A with the filmmaker. So while we're waiting for people to join, I'm going to share my screen. And here is the trailer for Cecilia Aldarondo's film, Landfall.
Uno se maravilla con las bellezas de Puerto Rico, uno se maravilla de que Puerto Rico es alegre, de que nos gusta fiestar. Pero al venir María, entonces nosotros pudimos ver lo jodidos que estábamos.
El verdadero desastre vino después. Más de 5.000 personas fallecieron por la inacción precisamente del gobierno.
New investors are coming to Puerto Rico, people that want to protect their wealth.
Government services should be privatized and put in your hands because you can make money doing it.
El gobierno que parece que no le importa la economía en la que tú tienes que sobrevivir. Entonces no es justo.
How well is that going right now?
Ten mucho cuidado con cómo usted me está hablando, amigo. Usted es un hombre blanco y está en mi terreno.
Como un denominador es el bienestar común.
Y a la gente sentirse vulnerable, pues ¿qué van a hacer? Después de María dijimos, ¿sabes qué no?
Para decirle a un joven, no coja un adoquín cuando quizás se le murió su abuela por falta de esta gente. ¡No se va a acabar!
Era el huracán que teníamos estacionado en el centro del pecho.
Ahora o nunca. Yo quiero vivir esta isla como se supone que la podamos vivir. Nuestra.
All right, so thank you for joining, everyone. And I just want to introduce myself. I'm Nicholas de Villiers. I'm professor of English and film at UNF. And we are joined by Cecilia Aldarondo, the director of Landfall. Cecilia and I actually graduated from the same graduate program in Minnesota, Comparative Studies in Discourse and Society. And Cecilia now teaches at Williams College in the Department of Art. And in fact, we've had Cecilia before for a director Q&A at UNF in 2017 for her film Memories of a Penitent Heart, which I also highly recommend. Is that available through Point of View?
It's actually currently on Vimeo, so you can,
excellent.
Yeah, you can rent it on Vimeo.
That's wonderful.
Mhm.
And so hopefully everyone had a chance to watch Landfall through the link from Good Docs. And I also highly recommend looking at the study guide that comes with the link. We were just talking before this about it's a really excellent and really informative and full of really helpful resources. I want to thank the Department of English and my chair, Keith Cartwright. I would definitely also want to thank the UNF Library for arranging this. Lena and Maria at the library, I really appreciate your help. And Dr. Laura Heffernan, my colleague in English, for helping us arrange this webinar. And basically the way that this webinar will work is you can ask questions either in the chat or using the Q&A function. And I have some questions for Cecilia about her film. We have some questions and comments from our documentary students from Dr. Gillian Smith's class. But I think we'll maybe, I'll ask maybe an opening question, or do you have any opening remarks that you want to make, Cecilia?
No, just that I'm really happy to be here, even virtually. I grew up in Orlando, so I'm really excited to it's been a virtual life for this film, but I always recognize the Florida ties, and I know there are a lot of people that are connected to Puerto Rico in Florida, so it's always meaningful to me as a diasporic Puerto Rican to be particularly talking to people based in Florida.
And someone is asking in the chat, you're also welcome to share your comments and impressions about the film in the chat. We appreciate that as well. So someone in the chat actually asked how things are going in Puerto Rico right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a big question. I think it's, I've been speaking about, it's weird because even before COVID, I was using somewhat medical terms to talk about Puerto Rico in terms of calling it, thinking about like the pre-existing conditions that Puerto Rico was already in. But I think that, or another thing I've been saying is that, if the United States has a cold right now, Puerto Rico has pneumonia. And, I think, this is one of the many ways that the pandemic is only sort of showing, and exacerbating inequalities the world over, and not just in Puerto Rico. And so I think, in Puerto Rico, the crisis continues unabated, and COVID is just sort of another layer of that. The pandemic response has been hard there. And, Puerto Rico is, if you follow the numbers of vaccinations, for example, Puerto Rico is dead last in the United States for the vaccination rates. So there are a lot of ways in which things have not changed, but at the same time, I will say that part of what we wanted to chronicle in the film is that this is also a very different moment, I think, certainly than my parents' generation, of like really extraordinary activism. And I've been saying to anyone that will listen that Puerto Rico is a handbook for our times on many levels, in all the good senses as well as in the difficult senses. And so I think if we want to be thinking about what it means to exist in crisis, and to exist in beautiful ways in crisis and in community, Puerto Rico is a really excellent place full of people who are experts in that. So yeah, but I can definitely say more. But
I was actually wondering if you could talk a little bit about the activist Lale, who is the person who kind of frames the discussion of the popular protests in the film, and how you met, what Lale's role is as kind of the narrative frame.
Yeah, so we never intended for Lale to be in the film initially. Lale and I met actually through an academic I was talking to you about, Yarimar Bonilla, who is an expert in Puerto Rico, Puerto Rican academic, but also works on issues of the current crisis. And I knew Yarimar, and I asked Yarimar, I said, look, I'm looking for somebody to collaborate with. I mean, part of this is that I was very aware from the very beginning that as a diasporic Puerto Rican who was raised outside, my parents left Puerto Rico right before I was born. There was just a tremendous amount that I was not, that I really didn't understand. And even though the project came about in a very visceral way, very personal way, very intense way, because I had a lot of family that was in Puerto Rico during the hurricane. My grandmother died after Maria. There were a lot of things that I was feeling very intensely connected to, but I think there's a really important difference to be acknowledged between the diaspora and those who are living in Puerto Rico day to day now. And we can definitely put a finer point on the diaspora. It's not a monolith by any stretch, but it just was very important for me as I embarked on this project to not fall into the traps of, I think, a lot of documentary filmmaking, particularly around disaster and crisis, where I could in fact become part of the problem and compound the trauma. So anyway, I asked Neriman if she knew anybody, and through various, sort of a grapevine, I met Lale. And, at the very beginning of the film, there's a line that's, where I say something like, if it weren't for Maria, you and I wouldn't be sitting here on this beach. And, there's the film is not explicitly about us, but we are the two people sitting on that beach. And this is partly because for me, I wanted to quietly frame the film as a conversation between a Puerto Rican based in Puerto Rico and a Puerto Rican in diaspora. And also kind of posit that part of the ethical, how do I say this, the operations of ethics in a situation like Puerto Rico are that there's various positions that one might take if you are sort of your levels of trauma are different. There's a way in which it felt to me incumbent upon me as a diaspora Puerto Rican to be in the position of listener and somebody that holds space. And so the film, in fact, kind of tries to do that. It tries to bear witness to what has been happening in Puerto Rico for over 500 years. And also sort of be there to, for those that have experienced Maria, to have the space to say what they need to say. And when I met Lale, Lale had really not dealt with the hurricane. Even though Lale is an activist who's been very, very involved in lots of stuff since before and since Maria, there was a way in which Lale had not processed. And anyway, we did these audio interviews very early in the process of making the film, and I interviewed Lale as a kind of test. And Lale has a very, very potent way of speaking that just ended up being the voice of the film. And we had a very close collaboration. This is why Lale's name comes directly after mine in the end credits. There's the documentary world is often, there's a role that's called fixer, which is, I think, often the local guide that that people from the outside, frankly, use. And I didn't want Lale to have that kind of subservient role in this film. So the film is as much Lale's as mine, and it would not be what it is without Lale's contribution. I mean, I can say more if you want to hear more, but that's really, it is not, we think of the director as this one voice. This is definitely a collectively authored film.
And that was actually one of the questions. So Lale is showing you images of the popular protests, the Ricky Renuncia protests, and I'm curious about that choice to have, not archival footage of those protests, but instead having someone showing you and sort of zooming in on their phone to pictures. Yeah.
I mean, this speaks to kind of a wider way in which you're trying to deal with this idea of a kind of belatedness. I mean, this is a film about aftermath, right? We always arrive sort of on the scene a little bit after the fact. I mean, it's not an accident that you never see the hurricane in the film, for example.
Yeah.
I think we've been inundated far too much with that kind of imagery. I think every time there's a hurricane, our media inundates us with that imagery. And I was really interested in what kind of space gets created when we just look away. And yet at the same time, there's a lot of ways in which I'm interested in memory as a very powerful political force. And in the case of Maria, I was interested, it was crazy because with the Hurricane María protests, I mean, this was both something that was very visceral and happened in real time in like bodies in streets, but it was also very much in real time a social media phenomenon. And we kind of wanted to get to that. And also this feeling that the nowness was already becoming history. We could sense that. I think there are these incredibly rare and special moments when you just know that you're part of something that's big. And so we wanted to signal that, like, how is this already a kind of archival phenomenon if you weren't there, you know, and how does sort of social media play a role in that too?
Yeah, I think Lala says, like, this has been shared this many times, so many people
exactly
this protest sign, you know.
Right. And if we had just, you know, shown that footage, right, just on screen like this, if it just sort of filled the screen, you'd have a different feeling. But we wanted to talk about these devices, you know, the phone as a kind of archive in and of itself, a social archive. And so, yeah, and we'd already been playing with this, like the scene in Villiers. I don't know if you remember where
he shows the map with the
so that we'd shot before, and part of this also was just that there's, I don't know, my cinematographer Pablo has very, very strong aesthetic instincts, and very early on he was just like, oh, we don't want to do that thing in documentaries where you just like put a map on the, you know, like that sort of we didn't want to do graphics or those kinds of like data visualizations or things like that. And so we were trying to figure out, like, how do we ground a viewer in the place and give them some information in a more creative way. So we'd already shot this stuff on the phone, and then we're like, why don't we just keep following this idea to its logical or illogical, I don't know, conclusion. Yeah, so it was somewhat experimental as well.
It's a really, I think that's the thing that many of the documentary students are responding to, and that I really noticed when watching the film, is there's as much of a you know, very strong choices about what you don't show. And including Donald Trump throwing paper towels, I think is, you know, and giving too much attention maybe to the cryptocurrency guys, or just letting them talk, I think is an interesting choice too. There's such a dialectic in the film where you just sort of let people talk without a voiceover and without a kind of critical commentary necessarily, but through their juxtaposition, you'd really get a sense of, you know, very different ideologies.
Yeah. And I think, you know, again, this is, you know, what our media is constantly pulling focus, right? There's this fixation on these charismatic figures that take up too much space anyway. And you know, again, I wanted to ask, well, what representations aren't we getting? What is, and also experientially, it's not just about what we see on screen, but how is it edited? How is it, you know, what's the pacing? What's the, and I think in a lot of ways, it's been interesting because, you know, some of the reviews that the film has gotten, it's like people are so ill used to seeing a film about disaster that is somewhat metaphorical and layered and you know, and slow and poetic. And I think people are expecting like an action film or something. And so, you know, we really wanted to the cryptocurrency, you know, what do we call them? Our antagonists, if you will. They are invaders, right? So we don't want them they're lucky to visit the film, right? So there's a way in which we didn't want to give them too much space. We wanted to insist that the space of the film is the space of who deserves to actually inherit Puerto Rico. And it's the space of Puerto Ricans. And so, yeah, we wanted to note that they are here, but not to let them take over.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions from the Q&A. So Raquel Rivas asks, I was impressed by how early in the film you introduced disaster capitalism with the investor conference. It was such a powerful juxtaposition. Were you already familiar with Naomi Klein's ideas on disaster capitalism, and how much of a central theme in Puerto Rico is that, or has that always been? And in the study guide, it's also, you know, saying like it's a new face for colonialism.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that too.
Yeah, no, thanks for that fantastic question. Yes, I was already familiar with Naomi's work, and I had read The Shock Doctrine years before, and I remember in particular being very struck by her chapter on Katrina. My little sister was in college during Katrina and had to leave New Orleans and didn't move back until many years later. And so I remember reading that chapter on Katrina, and I suddenly understood why her rent was so high when she moved back, or I understood these things that, you know, we are so ill used to connecting, which is, you know, a real problem, like environmental issues to things like gentrification. And so the framework of disaster capitalism suddenly really helps you see the way things that are policies that are being touted as solutions that are, oh, we're so excited because here's what we have. And, they said it in New Orleans after Katrina, they said it in Puerto Rico, like, we finally have a chance to do things. They say it in our film, right? And that sort of idea of a tabula rasa, this like, that's where Naomi Klein's thinking really helped me to see it, so that as soon as the hurricane hit, I'll just give you another example. Yarimar Bonilla, who is this academic that I continually recommending, who's an excellent book that she co-edited called Aftershocks of Disaster. In the press, in the sort of United States press, mainstream press after Maria, nobody was talking about this. And it was an article that came out in the Washington Post it was like maybe a week after the hurricane where something clicked to me. And it was an article by Yarimar that said, why would anyone want a hurricane? Because someone will get rich. And it was the first time that I was already concerned about the debt crisis. So I was thinking about disaster capitalism through the lens of debt. But it wasn't until I read that article that it was like, oh, this is happening. And I was thinking already about the tax laws that, they're the most liberal tax laws in the world for any rich American that wants to hide their money. Puerto Rico is the place. So I was already thinking about this stuff, and I'd been thinking about a film maybe about the debt crisis, and then this happened. So anyway, it wasn't just Naomi's thinking, but it was definitely, I highly recommend studying Puerto Rico alongside her work, because it's very connected.
And the name of the book again,
Aftershocks of Disaster is it's an edited volume that has a really amazing array of texts on Puerto Rico.
Thank you. And I think that that moment at the conference where is it Yaron Brook talks about Hong Kong. I mean, that's the part that makes it so clearly connected to kind of colonialism that, but I'm really curious at that moment where, there's also another moment where someone, they're talking to the kind of cryptocurrency guys, and they're saying, I'm an African who's Puerto Rican. And, we've seen this before, we've seen this rush, so I think that kind of placing it in a longer history of colonialism is really, really important.
Yeah.
But I'm curious how you gain the trust of people like the cryptocurrency guys or the luxury real estate. I mean, is it just that they sort of, maybe their ego means that they're they're not maybe self-aware?
It depends. I have to say, I'm not trained as an investigative journalist. I've never been really undercover before, but I felt like that's what I was doing, making this part of the film. Incidentally, but I think not incidentally, Yaron Brook, who makes that speech, which I think is really pivotal, he is the chairman of the board of the Ayn Rand Foundation, and he moved to Puerto Rico after Maria, again, explicitly because of these tax laws. And I think this is important because if you also want to understand how Silicon Valley is related to this kind of neo-colonialist cryptocurrency thing, studying Ayn Rand and her connection to tech is really important here. So sidebar, but so I read an article about Brock Pierce in the New York Times. There was a big article about how it was called making like a utopia, crypto utopia in Puerto Rico. And that was where it was this very, he was very clearly just out for publicity. But it was a profile of this guy I'd never heard of, who had moved to Puerto Rico and bought an old monastery and turned it into a boutique hotel and all this stuff. And I said, that guy, I want to know what that guy's doing. And they mentioned he was organizing a conference, and it was already coming. I think the article came out in February. The conference was in March. And basically I was like, I'm going. And I initially tried to get access as a journalist, and nobody would respond to my emails. They said they offered local discounts to Puerto Ricans. Nobody responded to those emails either. So I bought a ticket. It was over $1,000, and basically crashed this conference. And it was at the Vanderbilt, which is one of the fanciest hotels in Puerto Rico. It is owned by a billionaire named John Paulson, who is another, he's, I would say the biggest gentrifier in Puerto Rico. These are not coincidences that these are all happening in these places. So anyway, I went to this conference, and I basically crashed one of their parties. And that's where I met Quinn, who had the beard.
The beard guy, yeah.
The weird beard thing. And I saw him across the room, and he was wearing like a floor-length white leather trench coat, and he was carrying like a tin tankard, like a medieval tankard, like a flippy cup. You know, and it was very clearly like, oh, I'm so eco-friendly and I recycle, so I bring my own cup with me. And I said, I don't talk to that guy. And yeah, in his case, he's such a narcissist that he really loves the camera, and he said, I've got 4 people making a documentary about me, so of course you'd want to make one. And that makes things easier. Brock Pierce is a lot savvier. And so in a lot of ways, Quinn is kind of there as a stand-in, because we knew there's no way we could get Brock Pierce to give us that access that we had with Quinn. Yeah. Brock Pierce is definitely the much more influential kind of puppet master. But then we really lucked out with that confrontation with Brock. But it was a real kind of very tricky. These guys are very, very shady. Yeah, and it's weird. You have to do a lot of kind of code switching, I think, and sort of listening for what you think they want to hear. And yeah, we did it, but we didn't love doing it. It's icky being around people like that.
Yes. One other question in the Q&A, what was something unexpected that you learned from filming the documentary? I mean, I think, I know this from watching Memories as you were working on that film, that there were so many surprises over the course of making that film. So yeah. I'm curious.
I think for me, with every film I make, I think part of why I love making documentary films is that it's really transformative for me, even if that's not the goal, it's an inevitability. And I would say in this case, like I said, it was personal for me to start making this film, but there's a really hard thing about being from the diaspora, which is you don't know what you don't know. And I didn't have a sense of just how complicated this journey would be for me on that personal level. And it was weird because on the one hand, making this film reminded me that I will never be Puerto Rican in the way that I might want to be, because that is what colonialism does. It essentially robs you of your belonging. And, there's just this gulf of knowledge. And yet at the same time, I feel more connected to Puerto Rico than ever before. And it's because I read so many books, and also because I met so many people. And when I started this film, there was a lot of geography I myself did. Like if you see the map that sort of gets populated as you travel throughout the film, in a lot of ways, that was my experience too. I mean, some of the places were familiar to me, but yeah, my Spanish is a lot better, and I have and I moved beyond my sort of familial relationships to my homeland, and now I have a whole set of relationships in Puerto Rico that are kind of like my people. My family in many ways disagrees with me politically, and so there's an incredible way that I've been able to, like Lala is my person, for life. Like we have this bond. So yes, it's that unbelonging and belonging at the same time, I think.
And I was just thinking, that the question of kind of, I think Lale framed it as like the palante, like the, move on, and to forget, is this kind of, this pressure that people often are under. And that, to me, it connects to your earlier film, where you're looking at these kind of things that your family has also, the way the closet or kind of secrets, or about this kind of fear of forgetting something or covering something up. So I'm curious about that, that kind of connection, the critique of moving on, and in terms of how the disaster itself is covered, where you don't want to forget.
So I was thinking about this again, like all my work is about memory in some way. And in this case, I think it's more of a collective memory than a familial one. And one of the films that inspired me a lot when I was, researching and developing the film was a film called El Lugar Más Pequeño, The Tiniest Place. And it's by a Mexican director named Tatiana Hueso. And it's this beautiful film. She's originally from El Salvador, and she goes back to her grandmother's village where there was all this violence in the 80s, and it's all about memory as well, and kind of going back to the scene of a really traumatic moment in a country's history. And there's a moment in the film where somebody says, I think it's like, un pueblo que no tiene memoria es más fácil que sea un pueblo sometido, something like that. That might have the word. It's something like a people. It is easier to control a people without memory, and so that is something I wrote on my wall, and I was thinking about it the whole time. And when we were making the film, Tara, my editor, and I, we just constantly kept saying, this is a very old story. And what I mean by that is that, those erasures of history are deeply debilitating for a people. Even just for me, researching the film, I was raised, like many Puerto Ricans, with this particular narrative of Puerto Rican independence movement, and had no understanding of, for example, the mass FBI surveillance of pro-independence activists that, and just there's, you can read books now finally that have been published, and partly because the FBI finally admitted that they've been doing all this surveillance because they tried to eradicate that memory. But reading about just how systematic that debilitating. I was raised with this idea of, well, of course we could never be independent because look how weak that party is, right? Or that movement is like, it was always sort of laughed at in my family. And I didn't know anything about the people that had been imprisoned or, infiltrated, and the resistance that had been very, very robust up until a certain point in the middle of the 20th century. There was so many things in Puerto Rican history I didn't know. So I wanted to invite the viewer just a little bit into that process of kind of political awakening being facilitated by refusing to forget. And that's what Lala's warning about, right? She's saying, we cannot just move forward without looking backwards first.
Yeah. And that's actually, as well, the documentary students commented that, they were really moved by the impact of finishing the film and with the credits over the cover-up of the graffiti with these political slogans. I mean, it's like, it gives me chills, like in terms of how perfectly it summarizes that sort of idea of trying to cover something up or trying to erase something. Did you know that was where you're going to end, or how did you arrive there?
Well, we didn't know the protests were going to happen. So in that sense, we didn't know at all where we were going to end. We thought we were almost done with the film, and then these incredible protests broke out. And that changed everything. So we shot all the stuff on the beach, for example, between me and Lala, we shot while we were documenting the protests. We were at the same time. But I'm trying to remember now, we got this idea to film the next day after, because it was every night the protests were happening. But in the morning, there was always the cleanup from the day before. And we were like, well, what might we see? It's sort of, again, like this looking away. What happens when you look away from the thing you think you're supposed to be looking at?
Yeah.
And so we went down there. We weren't expecting the cleaning crew to just literally arrive like from central casting. Like they were just, it's like we had, planned it. And so we just started documenting it. And we knew, I mean, this is one of the great things I love about documentary filmmaking in particular, is that there are these moments of serendipity where something happens that you could not have ever scripted. And it just starts happening in front of the camera. And you're like, so we were, filming this and like very quiet because it was like dawn and it was sort of in hushed tones, but we just knew it was very special. And as soon as we got back to our apartment, we just started editing, and we sort of roughed out that material. So yeah, I think we knew as soon as, pretty much as, because my editor was part of the craziness of the protests. my editor dropped what she was doing and came with me along with my friend Martin, who we just dropped everything and went to Puerto Rico to film with and met Lala there. And so my editor became a sound recordist, and anyway, it's crazy. We were, you don't usually go back and edit, with while this is happening. But anyway, we did. And so I think because my editor was right there and she was there when we were filming and she was recording the sound, even I think as she was recording the sound, she was like, oh, this is going to be in the film.
Yeah.
And I think that we had a sense that it was the ending we've been looking for.
Yeah. And yeah, I forget about that you didn't necessarily know that the protest was going to happen and that it was going to be, because the film is framed now as like what happened in between Maria and Ricky Renuncia, stepping down. So that was again sort of part of the process of figuring out where the film was going to end.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard with a film like this. It's not, we don't have it doesn't have a conventional narrative structure. It doesn't have a beginning, middle, and end in the way that a lot of documentaries are, I would say the vast majority of documentaries are edited according to a 3-act structure. And this one is more essayistic. It's a polemical structure. And so how do you end that? And also because we were moving beyond the hurricane, it's like, you can go, do we go all the way back to Christopher Columbus, or, or do we just have a statue of him? How do you signal all these things? And so, yeah, it was pretty unwieldy. And I think we were also, these films are like, this is, I think, a very hard film to edit. Because it's like a Rubik's cube. It doesn't work and it doesn't work and it doesn't work and it doesn't work until it works. So yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking in terms of like the essayistic structure. The thing that I was thinking when I rewatched it is that there's this kind of dialectical structure, right? So there's like the graffiti and its erasure, the cryptocurrency guys and the socialist school, asking the sort of community like grassroots. There's all these kind of moments, and just by editing them together, I think you get that sense of kind of friction and
and I think that the risk is that it becomes binary, right? It's like, there's a way of, there's like a rural versus urban, or a left versus right, and Puerto Rican versus non-Puerto Rican, and we were really conscious of that. We didn't want the film to be reduced to that, but I think there's something that happens when if you have enough. It was originally a short film, and when it was a short film, it was basically like the farm and the real estate guys, and that was very reductive. It was too black and white. So anyway, I'm just saying that I think that the dialectical can work when you have a bigger container to have more gray.
Yeah. And I think what also helps is that there's also so much of a sense that because it takes place over 2 years, that what you're really trying to capture is not just a kind of warring ideologies at this moment, but also the structure of feeling immediately after. There's so many interesting discussions of like the feeling of being tired, the feeling of grief, or like things that are not mourned or not yet processed, but also like joy. I mean, the moments. Lale is a DJ, right? And I think that moment at this kind of that party is so beautiful. And I know it's interesting because there is that line that's in the trailer of like, when people picture Puerto Rico, they picture beauty and happiness and dancing and joy. And so you have to be sort of really careful about where you include your joy, and it specifically kind of queer and trans people of color's joy that you're foregrounding, I think, is really, really important there.
I think it's also about for whom is the joy, right? Yeah. So there's one thing when joy is performed for somebody else's consumption, it's a very different thing. I mean, you as the viewer are being allowed in, and you're being invited in, but you're very lucky to be invited in. And what I mean by that is that is a space, I mean, that space in particular where we filmed that party in Angar was, it emerged because of Maria. It did not exist as a space, and it is a queer, trans, feminist, BIPOC space explicitly for protecting people who experience violence on a daily basis in Puerto Rico. And it is not intended to be really for others outside. I mean, they do tons of community work, but the whole point is to sort of insist on one's pleasures. And I think that this is, when I say that Puerto Rico is a handbook for our times, that's part of what I mean. I think that, you know, there's such a way in which I think the most privileged in our society look at a crisis like COVID and they're like, oh my God, I don't know how to handle this. And it's, if you look at communities that have been experiencing violence, discrimination, you know, that's who knows how to throw a party in the middle of a disaster, you know? And so, because it's, you have to live, right? It's the sheer, you know, heroism of living in the everyday. And so that was something that was really important to us, was like, what are the pleasures of the everyday in Puerto Rico? How do we show the world that people know how to like crack a joke about Hurricane Maria while playing dominoes on the beach, when they're like, you know, there's so many moments of like, yeah, we all know the crisis is happening, but we're also taking a moment for ourselves. So
the moment around the dinner table as well, there's a real clear sense that it's like, this is really good food. We don't always have really good food, right? It's like the joy and the pleasure is related to you know, an experience of scarcity and a critique of austerity.
Yeah.
The most important critiques of austerity happen in that moment where you sort of get that sense of what would utopia look like. And some of it's kind of mundane stuff of like a feeling of safety, like you were describing, you know, of like, this is a space where I can feel, you know, relief and kind of, you know, joy. Yeah, there's a really, there's a great comment. It's a little bit long. Just want to thank you for making this film. I have some family members who live in Puerto Rico and saw how much it affected them. I love how you explained why you didn't show the hurricane in the documentary. The media focuses so much on the hurricane and not on the politics that made the island suffer as much. When you talk about experiencing dysphoria being raised in the States, I relate to this very much. I loved how you filmed the group of friends having dinner together. When they talked about their ideas of utopia, it made me so emotional. Are you still in touch with these people?
Yeah, and this is what I mean about, like, I'm sorry, I get emotional. This is the miracle of making a film like this. And it's funny because, you know, one of the challenges of making a film like this is because we basically kind of like dropped in so many different places. We chose this sort of breadth versus depth approach, right? If we had spent, you know, chosen to focus on 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 people, we would have been able to spend more time with everybody we filmed with. But the sacrifice we had to make was, you know, we had a few days of shooting here and a few days of shooting there and a few days, and yet, you know, it was particularly with that dinner scene, for example, you know, a lot of those people are Landa's friends, and they trusted us enough to let us film them. But because of that, and also because of the work that we're doing with the film now in trying to do outreach with the film in Puerto Rico, they're all involved in really amazing projects and initiatives. And so through that, like, as the film comes out, we get to continue to deepen those relationships. And some of them I would say are, you know, like my friends now, like Lucho, the guy with the beard, is, you know, like I talk to him independently of Lale. And some of it is, you know, it is around organizing and activism. And some of it's just like, hey, how you doing? You know? So that's what I mean. And I have to say, like, there's something I think so important and vital in being around people who understand that the jig is up. And what I mean by that is, like, people who have been awakened politically, there's a beauty to those people and to being with them that is very dynamic and exciting and really meaningful. And that makes it possible, I think, to have really meaningful interactions.
Yeah. So I'm just looking around at my other questions. Feel free to pose questions in the Q&A or the comments. People can also ask questions in Spanish. You're welcome to ask questions. I guess the other question, the other dialectic I noticed, at the moment where people are celebrating, you have people talking about how they can't celebrate. And so I was really struck by that choice of, like, it's one of the more kind of nationalistic flag waving moments. And so it's really interesting to also hear a sense of kind of maybe doubt or uncertainty, or I'm not ready to celebrate yet, because what happens when the federal government, you know, might come in. So I'm curious about that choice, you know, that to try to balance that scene out in terms of joy and doubt.
I mean, this is, it was, I mean, it's a head spinning thing to try and make sense of what you were experiencing in the moment, but we were feeling that ambivalence. Like, we had spent, you know, the better part of 2 years documenting the aftermath of this. And on the one hand, there's this extraordinary crescendo, like all of a sudden this, you know, this energy, this catharsis that yielded these protests that we hadn't seen anything like it. But there was also this, I mean, you know, part of it was just what, you know, the audio that you hear where people are saying, I'm not really ready. We recorded those at El Hangar after, like the next day. And we basically said, you know, we really want to sit down with people, because the thing is, part of the problem is, you know, the way that protest often functions in documentary is like, they're fighting back, you know, here, cue cool poster. And it's often like, yeah, it's something that's sort of one note. And we knew we didn't want to do that. And yet it was just what we were hearing. Like Lale, even in the moment, like we would be talking about this and Lale would be like, oh my God, I cannot, I mean, like we went down there in part because Lale was like, you have to come down here. It's crazy. Like every day, I don't even know who's organizing, you know, she usually knows like everybody who's organizing a protest in Puerto Rico. And it was like, I don't know who organized that one. Like every day there was a new thing. And so that was a sense of like, oh, wow, this is, you know, this is a victory. And I think people will say, like, even now, this was a victory. This is in 12 days, a democratically elected governor was ousted from office. 12 days and nobody died. You know, that's no joke. But I think people could also, you know, you have to understand, I think also that people in Puerto Rico know so well how the political machine works, that they could also see, oh, right, so this is, they're gonna sacrifice Ricky Rosselló for this one moment and then, you know, business as usual. They could also see, it was transparent. So anyway, I think we felt like we had to capture that, but we didn't want to diminish the moment either. Like, you know, we wanted it to, you know, that moment where people are singing you know, I think for those that are here that are Puerto Rican, you know, they know that song that is being sung, and Mi Viejo San Juan, like my father sang it to me like every day of my life, you know, basically every Puerto Rican knows that song. And that the fact that it was being sung in Viejo San Juan, it's a song about a man that has left Puerto Rico never to return. And it's in some ways the most nostalgic and kind of like sentimental song. But the fact that people in Puerto Rico are singing this song in this moment, it's like too much. And we just knew that it was potent, even for, you know, if you don't know the song. So anyway, lots of different reasons why, but we wanted to capture it all.
There's another question. I was wondering what the pre-production process of the documentary was like and how you find the right people to tell the story with.
Yeah, well, the thing about making a film like this is that there wasn't that much pre-production process. And, you know, I'm used to making other films that are like, it's really hard to get funding and you're, you know, just sort of, you know, you write 30 treatments and, you know, this kind of thing. I mean, this case, the hurricane hit Puerto Rico. I got the idea to make a film about it. And I wrote to Field of Vision, which is they produce independent documentaries. And I had made a short with them and an organization called Firelight Media, which supports BIPOC documentary directors. And so I had a relationship with Field of Vision. So I just wrote to them and I said, this happened. I don't really think it's been covered properly in the press. I want to make a short film. And they, to their credit, were like, okay. I mean, I had to kind of pitch it to them, and they just basically, they initially gave me enough money to just go to Puerto Rico and shoot and see what I could see. And then I had to kind of come back and show them what I had. And then we kept talking. And then we thought it was almost done as a short. And then I said, look, this is a feature. It's too complicated. And it was this like black and white thing. So that was a very, you know, very unusual and in a lot of ways quite lucky process, because in the documentary world, it usually takes a lot longer. It's pretty rare that you can get something supported kind of from day one. There are a lot of documentary filmmakers out there who are going into debt or, you know, doing Kickstarter or whatever it is that they're doing to try and get a project off the ground. Yeah. And we didn't have to do that. So yeah, but it was also kind of zany. You know, we were finding the style of the film kind of in the moment, and a lot of instinct.
Mm-hmm. And another question that's related, how long did you film on location in Puerto Rico?
So the hurricane hit in September of 2017, and we did, I want to say we finished the film in 2020. So that was about 2.5 years, which is pretty short for a feature documentary. And we did, I mean, our shooting ratio was pretty tight. We did like, I think like 6 or 7 shoots. And I was teaching full time as this was happening. So it was, I didn't have the luxury of being able to go and just stay there. Also, we didn't have the money to pay like a cinematographer that many days and things like that. So our process was mostly like Lale doing, like I would think about the kinds of things we wanted to shoot. I mean, initially I was just doing it on my own, and so like the farm and the real estate scene, I was figuring a lot, that the crypto stuff I figured out. And then when Lale came on, Lale was really instrumental. For example, when I knew we wanted to go to Villiers, because I knew Villiers was, as Lale says, the colony of colonies. It was a highly symptomatic place in Puerto Rico. And so I already thought that was the case. And Lale, who hadn't spent much time in Villiers at all, went to Villiers and just met some people. And that's where she found Ura and Nisha, the young couple, and came back and called me and said, I've met these amazing activists and I think we should film with them. And I was like, great, let's do it. So there was that kind of thing. So we would have these like periods of research in between.
The Villiers moment is really interesting too, because there's that moment where she finds the black sand and she's like, don't get this, don't tell people. So it's like that sort of anxiety about how much real estate is being bought up, the sense of kind of like staying there versus moving away, because so much of the rest of the conversation at the dinner party is also about like, I don't want to see more of my friends moving away. And again, you know, I think that's one of the things about the structure of feeling in the film is like the sense of the diaspora of how many people did end up moving. I have many friends who were part of that, you know, so I think that I'm really glad that Villiers moment is in. I'm curious, there's a very enigmatic moment where they say Gracias Maria about something that's happening to the land. It's so weird, and like I'm just really curious.
They're being really sarcastic.
Yeah.
It's a joke. Like they're just basically, and this is part of what was so wonderful about filming with them. And I so prefer to film with people I like than people I don't like, because we would develop this kind of rapport. I think that's part of what you see on screen is their ease with us and friendliness. And they're just kind of, you know, they're just being cheeky. They're being ironic, right? They're like, oh yeah, thanks Maria. They're like, and they're also, this is the other thing. They are imitating a tour guide. Like they know, right. They're like, the way in which part of what we're trying to invert many things in this film, but one of them definitely is the kind of tourist native gaze. And there's just this way that I think, you know, people, I mean, you could even, I mean, we were intentional in how we shot them. It looks like kind of like the Blue Lagoon or something right there. There's this kind of like, you know, idyllic, what is that phrase, the native, not the unspoiled kind of, you know, naive, feral, whatever. I mean, there's a way in which they're, you know, we're sort of playing with that trope. And then they adopt the posture of the tour guide, and then she's very performatively, and she's an actress, and so she's doing this like, on this side you will see the marks of Maria, and that's when they say, oh, thank you, Maria. Like they're totally kidding. Yeah. And it's part of it too is to insist, like, you know, there's this horribly victimizing way that people in Puerto Rico are talked about, as though like these innocent souls who have no idea what's happening to them and just are powerless and waiting for Donald Trump's aid and impassive. And part of what we wanted to demonstrate in this as like nuanced way of possible is to demonstrate how acutely expert these people are. And you know, like they're like in their early 20s, and you would, you know, they're just a way in which I think people, like young people, are dismissed as though they like don't know stuff. And they know
Which is why his explanation of the kind of military history on his phone is so important. But yeah, I really appreciate sort of irony and dark humor, and you know, it's something that I'm teaching a course right now on camp, and I know you also teach courses on AIDS activism, and it seems like those two things don't go together, but they were so crucial. That kind of, you know, the mixture of kind of theatricality and dark humor within AIDS activism, you know.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, it's also gallows humor, right? Yeah. There's a whole genre that is like about how do you have to crack a joke, because otherwise, what are you going to do? You just won't get out of bed.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is part of it too.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I think laughing, and I think obviously there's moments of kind of tears and grief, but I think that's the other thing in terms of the kind of balance in your film, or sense of irony, or sense of a dialectic in your film that I really appreciated in that moment.
Thank you.
And yeah, I mean, I guess that's another question, since you do teach courses on AIDS and cinema and AIDS activism. What your experience is, you know, documenting this one disaster, which you're saying is not a natural disaster, right? It's very much a kind of pre-existing condition, and I've seen it a lot among people who are AIDS activists, is that this sense of this kind of uncanny, like, what lessons have we not learned with the current pandemic? But you're releasing your film at this moment that has these really important lessons about what not to do in these moments. So I'm curious, you know, how you've kept that kind of in conversation, either in your courses or in your activism.
Well, I always develop my courses in relationship to what I've learned making films, and this semester is no different. I developed a new course, which I'm still finishing my syllabus. We haven't started yet. We start next week. Unfortunately, we start way too late as far as I'm concerned, but a new course called Art in Times of Crisis, and AIDS in Puerto Rico feature heavily, prominently, because for me, part of the, you know, I think we have these really problematic kind of rarefied ways of talking about art making, particularly in the West, that are just really elitist, and you know, often this idea that, like, I mean, no offense to Virginia Woolf, in a room of one's own, and like I do think that people in Puerto Rico would say, yeah, I wish I had some more time to make my art, you know. But at the same time, I think this idea that like art is a luxury, and that somehow it's extraneous to the world of crisis. AIDS in Puerto Rico really belie that. And I think some of the most profound art gets made in extraordinary moments of difficulty. You know, and I remember when I was making Memories of a Penitent Heart, you know, I didn't develop a course, I didn't intend to develop a course on AIDS, but part of it was I was researching, you know, doing research for the film, and that was where I discovered, you know, David Wojnarowicz and Derek Jarman, and you know, just like in Silver Lake Life, and all of this, like this incredible body of art making that was also really tied to activism that I didn't really know about, you know. And I was looking at like Diamanda Galas, and just all of these like really extraordinary, this aesthetic of politics and rage and suffering and humor, and, you know, so, you know, it's not an accident, I think, that these moments of real difficulty can also yield. And also, you know, for me, part of it is I look back to Puerto Rico in terms of the political struggles, and I think, you know, people like Lale says at a certain point towards the end of the film, in the party in El Hangar, she says, I don't want to spend my whole life fighting. And I think that there is something really telling in that sentiment, that, you know, it's like, what are you fighting for? What are you fighting for if there's a world without art, or if there's a world without fun or pleasure or dancing or whatever it is? So, you know, that I think is really key too.
Yeah, yeah. And again, the importance of kind of utopia while critiquing the dystopia of austerity and you know, these kind of neoliberal solutions that are kind of false promises.
Yeah.
I really appreciate in the film.
Yeah.
So we had you for an hour. Please, if there are any other questions, I think that It's been so wonderful to be able to talk with you. And maybe you could talk about your what you're working on right now, other than teaching, and if you have other film projects that you started.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, again, talking about the development process on different projects. I've been working for the past 4 years on a film about my high school experience, which was very tortured, and I was bullied, and I grew up in, like I said, in Orlando. As one of the few non-white kids in a very kind of white, waspy part of Orlando. And so I've been making this very funny film in which I reenact my memories of traumatic, of my teen trauma, and I'm playing myself as a teenager. So it's really campy and strange and absurd, but it's a little bit Revenge of the Nerds meets Heathers meets Carrie meets Mean Girls. And it's
all of my favorite films.
Oh yes, well, you know, high school is another. Oh, see, Winter Park, of course. Yes, David, it is. Yes, he's like, of course. Unfortunately, yes, you know exactly where I went to high school. Yes. Yeah, so it's but it's really fun to make a film like that as a kind of antidote to some of it is tough making films about such intense subject matter. So
yeah,
it's been really fun to work on.
I think it'll be really enjoyable to watch, because I definitely have noticed during the pandemic, I think everybody's sort of getting the sense of regressing, and like weirdly things are getting dredged up. I think in our experience in isolation, you're sort of like surprised to find, you know, that you're like old habits are coming back and
right
are coming back. So
yeah, exactly. And it's also, I think, it's going to be a delightful kind of distraction. I mean, as much as I think it's important for us to be tuning in and dealing with the political realities of our moment, I think there's also something to be said for having a little fun and a good comedic romp.
Yeah. That's great. I look forward to that. And so just a reminder to everyone, again, thanks to the library, we will be, they're working on getting a permanent copy of Landfall for our library. Also, our library has a copy of Memories on DVD, a physical copy, but thank you for sharing the link in the chat to Memories. I encourage people to check out the Good Docs, the study guide. It's really excellent resources at the end of that. Again, if people want to learn more about Puerto Rico, about this kind of popular resistance movement. And yeah.
The other thing I just wanted to say before we go is that the film is going to be broadcast on PBS this summer. And in between, in April and May, we're going to be doing a whole virtual series of events online that is going to be accessible to really anywhere, around a lot of the issues that the film brings up. And so it's going to be a really useful opportunity for people who haven't seen the film. So if you have friends, family, colleagues that you think should see it, they should follow. Really, we're just doing it all on social media. So if you look us up on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram.
Landfall.
Yeah, it's I mean, we have 3 different handles, so I have to dig them up, but there's it's like, I always forget, there's like a Landfall doc, Landfall film. 1 second, if I can get them to you.
And while you're looking those up, I also just want to congratulate you on the nomination for an Independent Spirit Award.
Thank you.
So it was so thrilling to see Laverne Cox, you know, saying the name of your film, and yeah, it's been so.
I won't get over hearing Laverne Cox say my name for.
Yeah, right. I wouldn't.
Right, I know. It was an entirely unexpected pandemic win.
Yeah, absolutely.
You live for the little things, and that was a big one. But okay, I'm pasting all of our handles here if anybody wants to take a look or follow us there on our respective things. But that's where we're going to keep people posted. But the reason I mentioned this also is just that it's a very, very independent film, and we rely a lot of word of mouth. And I think a lot of people will be like, oh, I don't know where to see it. I mean, we're not on Vimeo. We're not on, this is it's a great way for if you want to tell people about the film, they can follow us there and they'll find out more.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you guys. Thanks to everybody who made time on this busy day.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. And
thank you.
I see some thanks in the chat.